Hi, welcome back to CS170 spring session. Couple of admin items before we go on. Okay, and this will be the last lecture for this week, I think, chapter 2. So very quickly, uh, some people have been asking me about lab hours and whatnot, especially with respect to asynchronous, right? So asynchronous doesn't mean that you just look at the book and look at the materials, and that's it. That to me is like no engagement at all, right? Asynchronous just means that uh, we're communicating with each other, but it doesn't have to be instant response, right? It doesn't have to be a live session, okay? But having said that, we do want to encourage engagement, interaction, whether it's through emails or whether it's through office hours, lab hours, and stuff like that. Okay, so if you look at the lab hours, which again, remember lab hours are open for everyone. So anyone from any section can go to any of these lab hours. So it doesn't matter. So maybe there's a particular TA that you get on well with or explains things that you understand better. We'll then try to look at which one of them will show up here and engage them, or just contact them and have a specific office hour with them. Okay, so look at the hours here. It's pretty much going from morning until nighttime, right? Like 10 o'clock at night. And like I said, we can always schedule different times too. So hopefully this opens up enough hours, enough coverage that you can engage, right? This class is not meant for you to just read the book, look at the PowerPoints, and just show up for the exams or quizzes or turn in the assignments and you're done, right? Some people can do that, to be frank. But I think for a lot of you, it would benefit you to have some of that engagement, right? So I do encourage you to go to lab hours and office hours. You can see here's the TAs, here's the different professors, right? For me, I'm down here Friday, Monday, but I do encourage you to send me an email before you come. I try to do these things one-on-one. I try not to have people stacked up or whatnot. So I would prefer for people to send me an email if they're going to come to my office hour. Okay, so um, again, I just want to reiterate and encourage that. Now, some people have also asked me about, well, how do we take attendance? So like I said, for my stuff, the way I kind of look informally at attendance is really just placing some questions throughout my lectures and asking people to send me a quick email and respond to them. I'm not asking very hard questions. I'm not asking questions that you have to write a very long essay for. It could even just be a couple sentence, whatever. Just a quick email so I know that you saw the video. I think that's fair enough, right? And as you see later on in this class, I do try to structure the questions to maybe help you to prepare. Let's say we're doing an open book exam, help you prepare like a quote unquote a cheat sheet that you can use for the exam. So I try not to give like busy work, right? So everything I ask you to look at or do is with a focus in mind of you doing well in this class. Okay, so it's not busy work. So I think that's the idea. Hopefully that answers people's questions about attendance with respect to an asynchronous class, right? Meet with people, whichever TA you prefer to meet with. Um, the TAs individually will have their ways of keeping track of attendance. Some people record you picking up on their YouTube video. Some people actually have a sheet with similar to what I do in terms of having questions that you can answer, simple questions that you can answer, and that's their way of quote unquote tracking attendance, right? And recitations definitely is something that the TAs have to turn in for each class. I don't have to turn in attendance, but again, I do my extra credit to encourage people to attend or watch my videos. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies things, what we mean by attendance for classes, in our case, especially for asynchronous. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much more time on that. Just want to kind of get that out there. Okay, so let's get back to where were we here before in terms of chapter 2. Human-computer interface. And let me make this screen bigger. here. Okay, so I left off, this is basically old style text interface, right? Command line interface, right? Um, and let's move on to some of the other types of interface, right? So now you get into this, right? So this is the idea of having a desktop, right? And remember what I was saying before with the first computer, Xerox, the Alto, right? And then this is using a graphical user interface, right? You're going to see that all over the place. And this is the next step after text, right? Um, and, you know, basically it's designed for people to use Office, right? And what you picture normally at an office at that time was the idea of a desk, right? You have a filing cabinet to put stuff away in. Um, you know, it's kind of like a metaphor, right? And which is the next thing we're going to get to, okay? So here's the metaphor, right? So you picture back in the old days, there was a desktop. There was different things that you might have. You might have a diary or a calendar. You have like a little notepad, stickies or whatever. You can put stuff in there. You have a little calculator. You have a clock. Um, so where's my file cabinet? There should be, well, this is like a disk to save things. Um, and you can see these different things here. You can kind of do like a little bit of a drawing thing here. This is your notepad. This is like your calendar, the clock, the calculator. Okay. So this is what's meant by a metaphor, a desktop metaphor, right? So it's basically it ties back to the idea we had before about um, a level of abstraction, right? It's a way to have an interface that a person can relate to, right? A person can look at it and say, oh, intuitively it makes sense to me, right? So just like you might think on Apple, like the iPad, right? So, you know, my daughter was like a couple years old or whatever, and you give her an iPad, and intuitively she knows to touch the screen, drag things around, and you know, resize things, move things around. No one gave her an instruction manual, but just the way we engage with the physical world and to be able to draw, let's say, an analogy to interfacing with the computer is the easiest way for people to easily grasp how to interact with the computer, right? So in this case, this first example or initial example is around a desktop metaphor, okay? And so this talks about the metaphor and how that translates into the GUI, right? So again, you have this idea of a desktop, right? And you have these slider, dials, buttons, and touch, right? So, you know, I guess probably in the old days, you had like stereos or whatever. You had like uh, these sliding things that you can, you know, switch the balance to make it go to the left or to the right, or you can make the fader to go front or back, things like that. Dials like to tune the station on the radio. Uh, you know, you have buttons and whatnot. These are things that are basically things you're used to from the physical world, and then trying to translate that into something that you can use to control the computer. Okay, the touch I'm going to get to a little bit more. It kind of relates more to when you interface with the phone these days, right? A lot of these things can't really carry over to the phone because your phone only has a small piece of real estate, and that's why you get into the touch side of things, right? So in this book, when they talk about metaphors, this is the context that they're talking about here. Yeah, so now you look at this, hopefully without too much training, you can look at this and it's somewhat intuitive to you on how all these things work, right? Um, you know, some maybe not so obvious, but for the most part, you try to make it somewhat obvious when you look at it and say, oh, you know, for example, I look at this one that I'm circling around, this purple one here. You say, oh, this looks like a conversation. It looks like people are maybe talking to each other, right? Um, this maybe looks like something to do with playing music, maybe, right? this looks like maybe something to send email, right? Uh, this looks like a little camera, right? For example, right? Okay, now probably something pretty famous for most people is the idea of Mac and the mouse, right? Um, and for some of you, you may understand some of the history behind it. Um, but for those of you that don't, you know, one thing to note is that Apple did not invent the mouse, right? Uh, so this is something that was invented actually quite a while before Apple picked it up. Um, but Apple, Steve Jobs, had this vision about how things should look from a user experience standpoint, right? So I think that kind of led to how people looked at the mouse, right? And so they introduced it, um, and that's kind of history, right? That's how it went forward from there, right? Obviously, in the current day and age, we are moving to almost everything as being more of a touch interface. Okay, and this is where they're talking about the touch metaphor, right? So maybe some of you have been on airplanes, right? So this is the type of screen that you might see on the videos for your airplanes, where you would kind of hit it and you would swipe left or right or whatever to pick the movie. Um, so that's kind of like how the interface is evolving. Okay, and it's basically based on like the hardware that you're using, right? So probably less and less people are sitting at a desktop computer, uh, to work, right? A lot of times people are working on mobile devices, um, or in this case, we're talking about consumers, right? So a lot of people, you're not getting like a super big stereo video system, not even watching on your computer anymore. You're probably watching stuff on your phone. Um, and so all that stuff, because of the size um, of the phone, you really need to look at things in terms of touch these days. Okay, and so like what I just talked about, right? The touch metaphor is kind of where we're going to, uh, kind of replacing the mouse metaphor. Okay, uh, and so again, like I said, it changes how people will interact with the computer. Okay, and small screens, like what I was just saying before. And yeah, you're not going to carry a mouse with your phone, right? So that's kind of where we're going to right now. All right, so let me kind of roll this back for a second. Early days, because of technology and where things were at, it made sense to go with a metaphor, which kind of replaced or was analogous to a desktop, which a lot of people were used to back then. Okay, a typical office desktop, right? All right, and then more recently, we evolve because of the current footprint of our devices more to a touch metaphor. Okay, all right. So hopefully that recaps it for you. All right, now the next concept here, we're talking about reproduction. Right, so you probably see it a lot, right? You take a picture on your phone. Maybe a lot of you have stuff from the phone goes up to the cloud, right? And so and when you take a picture with a phone, it takes up huge amounts of space if you take it with the max resolution, right? Um, and so both in terms of uh, sending it to other people and storing it, that's a huge amount of space if I have to store for every single person like a gazillion pictures, right? So there's this idea of like, how do we do compression, right? And does it generate a perfect copy or a copy that looks pretty good but not 100% reproduction of the original? Okay, so when we talk about loss of quality, we talk about a lossy compression, right? That means that when you move to that copy, there's no way for you to go back to the original version, right? So whatever you've lost in terms of quality, or even, it doesn't necessarily have to say quality, but let's say it's quality, you're not able to ever capture that again. Versus, a lossless compression, that means whatever copy you have, you can always come back and recreate the original copy if you want. No loss, a perfect reproduction. Okay, so here, perfect reproduction. Oops, did I miss that? Here we go. Perfect reproduction. So as I was mentioning before, computers think of everything in terms of zeros and ones, right? So we store everything in terms of zeros and ones. And theoretically, I can just copy every single 0 and 1, and it means that it's a perfect reproduction. That means you cannot tell the difference. There's no difference between the first one and the second one, the copy, all right? Because you just basically copied over the zeros and ones. So that's what's meant by, as an example of perfect reproduction, okay? And I gave an example here, right? Let me resize this guy here. Here, okay? Not sure why this kind of flaked out on me a little bit. All right, I should squeeze this down a little bit here. All right, good. All right, so yeah, at least to the human eye, there should be no difference between these pictures here, right? Perfect copy, reproduction, copy and paste, right? So that's what's meant by a perfect reproduction, okay? And speaking of devil, copy and pasting, right? So here's the copy and paste. So it's all over the place, right? Whether it's Word documents or whatever, you say, oh, this looks pretty close to what I want, so I'm going to just copy and paste it, and then I'll tweak the copy of it, right? So a lot of people will do this almost all the time, right? Ton of times that you know that you've seen something before, right? It could be a legal document, it could be like a calculation, it could be a PowerPoint, right? It could be a whole bunch of different things. They say, oh, let me just take a whole copy of this so I don't have to start it from scratch and just tweak the different things that's specific to what I need to do. So you'll see copy and pasting it all over the place, right? And so these are kind of the points that is what they're listing as benefits for copying and pasting, right? And remember, I alluded to this a little bit when we were doing the idea of the consistent interface, right? So actually Apple and PC are kind of similar, right? Where like on the PC, I'll do Control C for copy, right? And Control V for pasting, okay? And likewise on the Mac, I should be able to do a Command C for copy and a Command V for pasting, right? That's just an aside. You don't have to memorize that, right? But my point being is consistent interface, right? Even though as much as we say like Mac and PCs are different, which they are different in a lot of ways, but there are some commonalities on things like these applications, these Office applications, you know, where you're editing stuff, whether it's pictures, documents, or whatever. This idea of copy pasting between applications, creating new instances, saving it, they all kind of work in a consistent way because there's no advantage. In fact, there's a big disadvantage for you to do things differently. So everyone who creates this type of software, you know, there's no competitive advantage to do something differently. They're going to try to keep it the same. Okay. Same thing with find and replace. Again, it's the same thing, consistent interface. So Control F to do a find, right? And you can do a replace all, right? And so you're finding stuff through a doc or it could be Excel spreadsheet or something like that. So it's find and replace. Okay, and then there's just like a check here. Actually, before I go into that part, let me just come back to here. So what I just did here in terms of perfect reproduction and what I've mentioned about lossy compression and stuff like that, we're actually going to cover that in more detail in future lecture, right? This is just chapter 1 or chapter 2, I should say, introduction. We'll copy more in this topic of like lossy or lossless compression and all that kind of stuff. So there's more to come on that. But here's like a check. here's like what does a UI stand for? What does a UX or user experience mean? Okay, and this is where I ask people for my extra credit. Send me an email and tell me what you think about the Amazon user experience, good or bad, right? And how you think it competes with the rest of the e-commerce companies that you've dealt with. Okay, uh, perfect reproduction, and is it a property of analog or digital information? Okay, I think we just covered it 2 seconds ago, so you should know that. And what's the purpose of computers showing progress bars, right? Let's say when an item is loading. An example I gave was downloading, right? Okay, who introduced the mouse, right? Uh, what's a touch metaphor used for? Okay, uh, give the advantage of a consistent interface from a consumer's point of view, which is what we just touched a second ago. Again, you know, this is not like a tricky thing or whatever, right? You can see the answers down here and whatnot, right? This is just key concepts for you to try to remember because it's going to be on your quiz and whatnot. So make sure you understand and know it. I don't think it's too hard to memorize this or understand this actually is better than to memorize it, right? And then give the advantage from a vendor and a developer's point of view, right? And again, the answers are down here at the bottom. Okay. Yeah, and again, just a review here, right? So try to understand these terms here, right? All of these, right? And if there's any questions, feel free to give me a shout. And that's it for this week. We've covered chapter 1 and 2. All right, thank you for your time.